G'day, watch this.
Thank you, Jai. Just a message to the representative here of the Prime Minister and the government's dirt unit. You could turn your tape recorder off now because nothing important will be now said. Jai and I are going to propose that when a new government takes office in Canberra, that there ought to be a reorganisation of the ABC, and the person in charge of that and the manager. And what more fitting person to manage the ABC than our speaker tonight? There's been calls tonight for a Royal Commission. A Royal Commission can, as you know, only be appointed by a government. But there are two governments. The government in Canberra is not going to, under this government, appoint a Royal Commission. But since the entity was established here under very strange circumstances, wouldn't it be justified for the Premier of Western Australia to now establish a Royal Commission into the circumstances of its establishment and the strange loss of important documents from the archives of Western Australia? Michael's referred to the great Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill was once taking a young colleague into the House of Commons, and he pointed out where the Speaker sat and where the government sat. And the young man said, "Oh, and over there opposite the government is the enemy." And Churchill said, "No, the enemy sits behind me." Now you see a demonstration of that tonight. Tony Abbott, Julie Bishop, Michael Smith are not the enemy of Julia Gillard. It's those members of the Labor Party and in Labor circles, such as Labor lawyers, who feel that something is wrong, that they should report this. And it's coming out gradually, it's trickling out, and I think it will continue to trickle out for some time. There are three important things we should bear in mind in relation to this. The first thing is obviously the integrity and the character of the Prime Minister, as you've so rightly put it. The other thing is this terrible mess, this massive corruption which appears to be there in the trade union movement. As Michael said to me, he said, with the greatest respect to you, the leader of the Plumbers Union, for example, is no longer a man who started out as a plumber who comes up to the top and leaves the union. He said the problem today is it's you loyalty types. They get people who've come straight from the university and they put them at the top, and they've got two things in their mind: making a lot of money and getting a safe seat in Parliament. And the trade union movement has been very much misdirected by these sorts of people coming into them. And it's very important. The fact is that trade union officials should be subject to the exactly same standards under statute of integrity and honesty as applied to company directors. There's no argument, I think, that could go against that. And the shocking thing is that under the Rudd and Gillard governments, knowing what had been going on, particularly in the building and construction industry, they've relaxed those standards. This is the government of Miss Gillard, who knows what's going on in trade unions, because she established this slush fund, and she has allowed this to happen under her watch. And remember that she was a minister in charge of that area. Now, the third important matter is freedom of speech and of the press. And this case demonstrates, if there need be, evidence of the sort of things the government got up to. Remember what happened with Fairfax. The file, what was to be broadcast, had been legaled. That's to say, it had been approved by Bruce Burke. Now, Bruce Burke is the leading defamation lawyer in Sydney. He cleansed it of anything which could produce any litigation. And the second thing is it had been approved by the internal editorial process of 2UE. 2UE, owned by Fairfax. Fairfax is making a song and dance about not putting Gina Reinhardt on the board of Fairfax because she won't sign this supposed charter of editorial independence. Well, what happened to the charter of editorial independence when an executive of Fairfax, harried by the Prime Minister's office 10 minutes before the Cronin interview was to go to air, stopped that from going to air? Something is very wrong at Fairfax. And News Limited, Murdoch's newspapers, John Hartigan went to water. They got a call from the Prime Minister who threatened a nuclear explosion, which was to unleash Bob Brown and have a major Leveson-type inquiry. The Leveson inquiry was about phone hacking by the British press. There's absolutely no evidence, apart from at The Age, of anybody going into phone hacking or going into data hacking. Well, why should they be frightened of that? What happened at News was that Glenn Milne lost his job. The ABC also sacked him from the insiders. And Andrew Bolt was warned not to write anything more on this. And for a few days, he had second thoughts about whether he would continue with News Limited. It was that serious. And of course, the ABC decided this wasn't newsworthy because they wanted to protect the Prime Minister. The ABC, which has a charter, which is supposed to act in the interests of all taxpayers and not one part. It is a very serious matter. Do you know, there was a letter, just as an illustration of the dangerous area we're going into. There was a letter in the West Australian on Saturday, and the writer said, and it was not an unreasonable position to take, he said that the foreign policy of Australia, that is, the vote on the Palestinian motion in the General Assembly, the foreign policy of the Australian government, that is to say, whether we would vote yes or no, was decided in a certain way. And remember, the government admitted, 26 million to get this wretched temporary seat on the United Nations. They forget to mention that we also spent billions of dollars in extra foreign aid just to get a temporary seat on the United Nations. We get that seat, and instead of having the insight to vote yes or no, what do? And instead of maintaining the bipartisan policy of voting yes in these cases, we abstain from voting. And this letter in the West Australian said he didn't expect to find that the foreign policy of Australia would be decided by the possible reaction of Muslim voters in Western Sydney. Now, if a piece of legislation which the government threatens to introduce, that is, a new discrimination act, is introduced, the effect of that would be to make that writer and the editor of the West Australian be brought before a court, and they would lose the right of the presumption of innocence, which we hear so much about in relation to Craig Thompson, because under this new act, it will be much easier to make complaints about discrimination, including matters which affect freedom of the press, and the onus of proof will switch to the person charged. So this letter writer will have to defend himself and prove that what he said was justified, as will the editor of the West Australian. It is very dangerous territory. Now, I first met Michael Smith on the telephone a few years ago when he phoned me when I was wearing a different hat. It was about constitutional monarchy, and I'm national convener of that organisation. He phoned me, and quite often when I'm phoned or asked about constitutional monarchy, I sense the hostility on the side of the reporter. I sense that the media had an agenda and still very much has an agenda in that area. It doesn't worry me, but I sense that. But what I found when Michael phoned me was that he behaved, as the Times said in the middle of the 19th century, the task of a national broadcaster, the task of a national newspaper, is to find out the facts on important issues of the day as best they can and broadcast them or write about them and make them the common property of the nation. That's the job of the media, and not many are doing that today. But Michael, I soon realized, was doing that, finding out the facts as best he could and broadcasting them. What he has demonstrated is that he is a man of principle. He was prepared to put his neck on the line in relation to broadcasting what he believed was to be the true situation. He had it legal. He refused to be stood over by Fairfax, and as a result of that, he lost his position. And strangely, he hasn't been employed in other parts of the media, which means that they are terrified of the dirt unit and the Prime Minister's office if they do that. This is a man of great courage and integrity. It's only recently I learned about his background. He was, as he says, a policeman. He was a member, he was a member of the army, and he was a businessman. He's a very cultured man too, notwithstanding what Crikey said. He was the chairman of the committee of local people in Brisbane that supported the Sydney Symphony Orchestra. He's a very well-rounded man, but a man of great principle, integrity and courage, and therefore it gives me great pleasure to move the usual motion of thanks to him, and I ask you to adopt that in the usual way.